As a renter, I think it's important to pay rent on time. It affects your relationship with your landlord. It affects your ability to have a good rental history when you're ready to move on to another location. It affects the reputation of renters in our entire community.
Sometimes people have trouble paying rent, and it's important to communicate that. I always appreciate, hey, my rent's going to be X number of days late, so I'd like the communication, and then I'd like a date that it will be paid by. Then I'm not going to worry about it.
As a tenant, if you get paid on the 15th, but rent is due on the 1st, and you have partially the amount of money to be paid, I often will contact my landlord and just let them know that I'm going to be late. If I can pay a partial amount now and the rest later, usually they're relatively accommodating. Understanding if you're a renter and you are having issues with your landlord, knowing where they're coming from is incredibly important. If you know that your rent payment is how they pay their mortgage, you're more likely to pay it on time and to be conscientious of the fact that they have a deadline to meet as well for their payments.
And I don't mean this to sound harsh, but it may come across that way. You don't get to live for free on someone else's property. Your obligation is to pay rent if you're going to live there.
It is important to pay the rent on time, especially we're a small rural community. A lot of landlords around here, they need that money to make their mortgage payment, to make their property taxes, to make their repairs, to make their insurance, which has really gone up in California recently. So a lot of those landlords, they're month to month, living paycheck to paycheck, just a lot like the tenants are sometimes. And I think without exception, all of the landlords I manage for have mortgages on their places. Some of the landlords that I manage for are young family members, and this is their first rental. Some of them are retired people who retired years ago, so of course their pensions aren't that big, and they really need to have this supplemental income. It's very important.
But it's also, at least for me personally, you know, I don't like being the rent police, you know, and it's a role that I play and it's part of my responsibility, but it's not something that brings me joy. In terms of quality of life for all the individuals involved, doing your best to pay your rent on time and or communicate when it will be paid on time is a really good thing.
It's really important to know that your rental history is critical to future housing as well as future employment. I get a lot of calls later for both references for housing as well as for jobs, and a lot of really good jobs, particularly in the sciences, require clearances and background checks for many areas, and they will call landlords for background checks and verification as well. And so all of the rental history that you establish during college impacts your future a lot. And it's something to never forget when you're in a house or an apartment.